Good afternoon, everybody. I am delighted to welcome you to today's webinar on the opportunities and challenges of exporting to Japan. My name is William Barnes-Graham and I am Digital Content Manager at Open to Export. We are an online community helping small UK businesses get ready to sell overseas through our step-by-step articles and guides, regular webinars, our Export Action Plan tool, and our quarterly competitions. You can find out about all of these on our website at www.opentoexport.com. Open to Export is powered by the Institute of Export and International Trade, the UK's only professional membership body for exporters, offering a unique range of individual and business membership benefits, education and training catering for beginners through to master's degrees, and an always exciting and prestigious programme of events celebrating UK businesses' exporting achievements. We will be running a live Q&A at the end of the session, so please do ask questions at any point during the webinar using the question box on the control panel to the right-hand side of your screen. We have the fantastic Steve Crane today from Export to Japan, who will be giving an overview of Japan as an export market. And so without further ado, I'd like to hand over to Steve.
Thank you very much, Will. And it's our pleasure to be here and to have the opportunity to take part in this webinar today. So to dive straight into the presentation, I'll just run through the content of what we plan to talk about. So on the next slide, please. This is what we plan to run through with you during this next half an hour or so. So just as a quick overview, I'll kick off by talking a little bit about the reasons why you may want to consider doing business in Japan. I'm well aware that some of you in the audience out there may already be doing business in Japan, but others may be thinking about Japan for the first time. So I'll give you a few reasons and factors that you should think about regarding why considering Japan. That will lead into a bit more information about the market size. I'm then going to talk a little bit about some of the big international brands that have managed to be successful in Japan and talk about that. But of course, it's not just about big international brands, it's also about British brands. And you don't necessarily have to be one of the really big players with big budgets in order to succeed in Japan. So I'll move on and talk a little bit more about some examples of that. I'll then talk about what I've described as the land of opportunity. And what I really mean by that is I'll talk about the sort of current trend of where Japan and the economy and the opportunities are. There's different messages in the press about the current state of the Japanese economy. So I'll spend a little bit of time talking about that and updating on that. I'll then touch on some of the particular high growth sectors where the really strong opportunities for growth are at the moment. Japan is clearly very famous for its appetite for innovation, so I'll talk a little bit about that. And then the next two sections will be diving in a little bit more to talk about the Japanese mindset from a sort of business cultural point of view, and then a few tips on how to think about and how to approach your business and interactions when you're dealing with Japanese customers or partners or other players in the ecosystem. And then I'll just wind up with a summary and a conclusion before we move over to the Q&A. So that's the framework we're going to follow. So if we dive in, first of all, to why consider Japan. So next slide, please. And next slide. Now, this particular chart that I'm showing you here, if there's one main takeaway from this presentation for you today, I hope it will be this one. And I actually saw this graph, or an older version of this one, about 18 years ago, back in year 2000, when I was working for a software company in Huntingdon, and we were thinking about entering the Japanese market and wondering, should we go into the Japanese market and how should we go into the Japanese market? And I happened to stumble across a version of this table or this graph 18 years ago. And it really had a significant impact on me, and I'll explain some of the reasons why. One of the first things to make you aware of is, of course, we all know that Japan is an island, so it has that similarity to the UK. And the actual geographic land size is actually pretty much the equivalent of the UK. So the size of Japan in terms of square kilometers or square meters, is about the same size as the UK, but it has twice the population. So whereas we have 60 or 65 million people living here, Japan has around 120 million people. So it's twice the population living on exactly the same size landmass that we have here. A second interesting point to note is that something like 75% of the population live on 3% of the land. So in other words, people are crammed into these big cities like Tokyo and Osaka and Yokohama, very, very crowded, dense cities, and lots of open countryside. And that has some dynamics on the way consumer behavior works, which I'll touch on later. But that's just a sort of an overview to help you get a snapshot of the size and scope of the market. But the specifics of this particular graph, as you can probably see if your eyes have been looking around it, you can see that there are certain prefectures in Japan, and a prefecture, by the way, is the equivalent of what we refer to as counties here. So they're called prefectures in Japan, and I think there's about 47 different prefectures covering Japan. But there are certain prefectures out there, and I've illustrated a number of them on this slide. Those individual prefectures have GDPs that are larger than a number of very significant countries. So if we take the Kanto region that you can see in the sort of right-hand side, the red-colored ink, the Kanto region has a GDP larger than Russia. The Chubu region over on the left-hand side has a GDP larger than Switzerland. The Kansai region, which is where Kyoto is based, also has a larger GDP than Switzerland. Kyushu region down at the bottom of the country has a larger GDP than Austria, etc., etc. I've just put a small flavor of some of them there, but I could go on mentioning particular prefectures or counties that have GDPs larger than many global countries have them. And once you start to really think about that and get your head around that, that to me is quite a significant thing when you think about approaching the Japanese market. Because there's no denying it is a very different market to do business compared to doing domestic business here in the UK or many of the easier, closer by trading partners that we have. You know, Japan is a different time zone, it's a different language, it's a different business culture. So it's a challenging one in many ways, but the way I always think about it is you've got one country there that speaks exactly the same language. They have exactly the same business practices and business culture and business ethics. Depending on your particular business model, if you work with a partner or an agent or a distributor or you're doing e-commerce, you can reach all of this market. You know, many distributors or agents have the capability to cover the whole of the country and the whole of the market. So in theory, you could actually enter one market that speaks one language through one sales channel. And if you get all of that right, that is a market that is bigger than Switzerland, Russia, Sweden, Finland, Austria, Hungary, and lots of other countries added together. It really does start to bring home the size of the opportunity in Japan. And if we could just move to the next slide, there's a sort of slightly different way of illustrating the point that I'm trying to make. So this is a different way of showing that the GDP of Japan is equivalent to that of Germany and Switzerland combined. Or indeed, if it was part of your strategy to think, well, we'd quite like to go into the Indian market, we would like to go to the South Korean market, maybe the Indonesia market or the Singapore market is also interesting to us. Well, they are 4 markets that have different cultures, different languages, different time zones, different work practices. And all 4 of those are still smaller than Japan, one particular market that you can go for, smaller combined in terms of GDP. So I hope that sets a little bit of the sort of initial thought process of the size of the opportunity in Japan. Okay, next slide, please. If we start to talk a little bit now about foreign companies and how they can succeed in Japan, again, there can be a perception that it is a very difficult country to break into. And as I mentioned earlier, it's not the easiest one. I will admit that. It's a challenging market and it's not easy to be successful. And Japanese consumers are very proud and they do support their own domestic brands and industries. So as a foreign company, you need to take that into account. But I've given a few examples on this slide here, again, just to show at a very high level, these are big global brands we're talking about, but it is examples of how foreign companies have got into the Japanese market and got themselves into very strong market leading positions. So for the soft drinks market there, Coca-Cola is number one with almost a quarter of the market share. In the coffee market, Nestle comes in at number one with almost a third of the market share. The US company Mondelez, I think it's pronounced, they are in second place, and the two of them combined hold almost 50% of the coffee market in Japan. Another example there with eyeglasses and contact lenses, Johnson & Johnson are the market leader in Japan, and they've got 14% of the market. So there's a few examples of really big international companies that have been able to succeed. But of course, we're not all luckily enough to be in that sort of size and scope. Many of us are more in the category of what's referred to as SMEs. So if we move to the next slide, I've put some information here of some British brands and companies that have succeeded and are continuing to succeed in Japan, and also some smaller examples. And just to talk through a few of these, I've consciously tried to pick different industries and different sectors because, again, I'm aware in the audience here today, there are all sorts of different companies from different sectors listening in. So I've tried to put a bit of variation in there. But if we just talk about one or two of these examples. So Paul Smith, the fashion brand that I think originated in Nottingham and is probably more London based now. We've done some webinars through our platform with Paul Smith, and he's a wonderfully engaging speaker when he talks about his journey into the Japanese market. And he talks about the early days when he was doing things on a very tight budget and flying in an economy seat on the aircraft out to Japan and negotiating his first few deals with agents and starting to get his first revenue coming. And step by step, the Paul Smith organization have built their business in Japan and remained very focused and worked very hard at it. And I think Japan now accounts for almost 50% of Paul Smith's global revenue. So it's a brand, as I'm sure most of you will know, that has become very famous and very successful all over the world, but almost 50% of the Paul Smith revenue comes from Japan. And I think the company has something like approaching 300 individual shops out in Japan now. So that's a great story of a fashion brand that started very, very small, but have worked hard at the market and grown the business very well and continue to grow and enjoy great success in Japan. There's a whole bunch of other fashion brands also that we could talk about from the UK that are equally successful in Japan. Moving up just above that, the brand on the left, Tangle Teezer. Some of you may remember this one because I think this particular company actually originally went on the Dragon's Den TV program. And this, for those that don't know, this is a sort of a new style of hairbrush that a particular inventor and entrepreneur came up with that means that long hair doesn't get tangled when it's brushed. And on Dragon's Den, I sort of famously remember all the dragons turned this chap down and said it's a daft idea and you'll never be successful. And he persevered and got his investment. But more importantly, for this topic, he was very determined to be successful in Japan. And I know with the first few visits over to Japan, people again said, you know, bringing a British hairbrush to Japan is just ridiculous because there are lots of hairbrushes here and lots of companies producing hairbrushes, and the health and beauty market in Japan has been around for a long time and there's been lots of investment in it. There's no chance for a small British product that's just a hairbrush to be successful in Japan. But again, they have been wildly successful. Again, I think it's one of the biggest international markets for the Tangle Teezer company in Japan. And I've even seen on a recent visit out to Japan, they had their adverts and sponsorship on one of the famous underground lines, the Ginza line. I went on one of the trains there and it was just completely covered in Tangle Teezer ads. So they're doing some sort of quite creative guerrilla style marketing to keep the brand growing strongly out there. So that's Tangle Teezer. Over on the right, I think we've got a few companies joining us today from the food and drink sector. So I included this one particular company called Brewdog. originated up in Scotland, and it's a sort of micro brewery, trendy sort of micro brewery, great beer, great branding. And they're another company that have been wildly successful in Japan. They opened one of their first outlets in Tokyo, created a lot of marketing and buzz around it. It proved wildly popular, and I think they're in the process of opening further outlets now. On the bottom left, moving across into to talk a little bit about the sort of creative design sector, there is an architectural practice, Klein Dytham, that have been doing very well in Japan. I think they've been active out there for 10 years or so now. And the image that we've included over on the left-hand side is a hugely iconic new building that's just been finished in a very, very prime location. It's on the Ginza crossing. For those of you that have been out to Tokyo, you may be familiar with the Ginza area. And that building was designed by a British architect, and it's a landmark site on one of the most prestigious crossings in Tokyo, and a great honor for a relatively small British architect design firm to land such a big iconic contract. And then we've got our friends Aston Martin, very famous brand, perhaps not such a small company, but I included them because at the moment they're on a roll out in Japan. They're investing heavily with new showrooms and new offices and building their team out there and using it as a platform to launch some of their latest vehicles and really high-end, top quality spec vehicles. And I know they are doing very well again out in Japan around the Britishness of the Aston Martin brand. So a little bit of a cross-section there to also give you a feel of some of the other companies in the different sectors that are managing to succeed out in Japan, including a number of companies that started very small and on very, very small budgets. Okay, next slide, please. So just building on this message of land of opportunity, just a few more facts for you to frame the Japanese market. So 62 of the Fortune 500 companies are Japanese, so over 10%. And by comparison, the UK has 26. Japan boasts the highest number of millionaires in Asia and is second worldwide after the US. So some pretty high disposable income, particularly for the sort of high quality brands and products that may appeal to that category of person. There is a great hunger for IP, intellectual property, especially in high-end electronics, biopharma, and business services. We've worked with a number of UK companies that actually license IP to Japanese companies for them to include in their products or for them to design their own products using British IP. And one interesting trend is that there is a new generation of young Japanese entrepreneurs coming through that are very much challenging the old traditional ways of doing business out there. Tradition still very much exists out there, and you need to know how to tap into that tradition in order to succeed. But it is very much a trend that young entrepreneurs are coming along and starting to challenge some of those ways of working now. And that's pretty exciting if you happen to be in any of those particular sectors. Next slide, please. It's a very stable place to do business. Commitments are upheld and things happen on time. This, for me, is one of the most appealing factors about doing business in Japan. It is basically a very, very nice place to do business. Society and people are very decent, very honest, very trustworthy, and that certainly carries over into the business culture. And you can feel, pretty secure about doing business out there, and the fact that you'll be dealt with in a very honourable, respectful way. Doing business holds fewer surprises in Japan than elsewhere in the region. With IP in particular, it's very well protected and very well respected. Payment you can feel very secure about. I've personally never had any bad experiences of never being paid or ever having any problems with payment. Deliveries and responses to queries always arrive promptly, and that general attitude to customer service in Japan is very, very high. There are consumers with high levels of disposable income. I mentioned that a little earlier on the previous slide. The amount of personal wealth is high, nearly $13 trillion in net financial assets held by households, which is almost equivalent to the value of the US GDP. Next slide, please. Consumers tend to be fans of both cutting-edge new technologies and services, and also high-quality imported products, which is obviously ideal for our UK firms with expertise in those areas. With an emphasis, I have to say, on the high-quality side of it. That's definitely a theme with the various companies that we've worked with and helped come into the Japanese market from the UK. Consumers focus heavily on quality, style, reliability, and a sense of tradition in a finished product, and they consider British companies capable of delivering all of that. And again, if your particular product or service, if they are the sort of values that you pride yourself around with your product and your service, then you're certainly going to be in tune with the Japanese consumers. This is a really interesting point. Most consumers today are those who made their money during Japan's rapid economic growth and have now retired, and they're looking to enjoy the fruits of their labors. So I'm sure we're all familiar with these sort of decades of huge growth going back into the 1980s period, when Japan seemed to be taking over the world, and there was lots of prosperity at that time. It's not quite as buoyant at those levels today, but the point I'm making here is that there is a generation of consumers out there that are very, very affluent. They are either retired or semi-retired. They have an awful lot of disposable income. They're generally fit and healthy people, and they are looking at ways to spend that income. And there are, again, British companies that sell products and services into that particular segment that are doing extremely well. Yeah, the over 60s have high levels of disposable income, and they're not shy about spending it on themselves or their families. Next slide, please. I'll touch a little bit on governmental reforms. So the Japanese government in particular are doing a lot to try and bring down a lot of the barriers. They are particularly interested in focusing on bringing inward investment into Japan. So looking to get foreign companies to go and set up operations out there. I know there's been some questions from the audience today about, is there support from the governments with setting up or doing business in Japan? Certainly, if you're planning to set up an operation, even if it's a small business out there, just maybe hiring one person initially, there's support and help from the Japanese government and various prefectures. And the government are doing things like improving and limiting the language barriers, improving internet access, simplifying regulations and admin procedures for setting up companies and doing business in Japan, and doing more to attract global talent and relaxing visa requirements. It's also generally a very business-friendly infrastructure out there. Great IT, great internet, amazing transport network, very safe and peaceful, ranking the first in Asia, longest life expectancy anywhere in the world, and a sustainable quality of life with good access to leisure facilities and a good medical environment. Next slide, please. I'll just touch on this one very quickly. These are the list of the top 10 or the top 12 high growth sectors right now. I will just sort of leave it there for a moment very briefly for you to have a look at. If any of you out there in the audience do happen to be in any of these sectors, then it's definitely a big thumbs up for you, because there is a lot of opportunity and a lot of interest in what the foreign world is doing in these particular sectors. So if you happen to be in one of these sectors, then great, you're definitely in a high growth area for international companies to do business in Japan. But if you're not in one of these, please don't worry, because I'm not actually saying you have to be in one of these sectors to succeed. There are lots of other sectors where there are huge opportunities and lots of British companies doing very well. But this is just a list of the current high growth ones, the current trend right now. I'll leave you to sort of digest that. I won't run through them all in the interest of time. So if we could have the next slide, please. Talking about innovation, so Japan ranks first among the G7 countries in terms of funding for research. It ranks first worldwide for the number of international patent applications per 1 million people. Science and technology related research is very active in Japan, and it has the 4th highest R&D spend in the world at 3.4% of world GDP. and the patent system is internationally recognized and praised. So again, you know, lots of UK companies that are working in innovation and research are either partnering with Japanese universities or companies or research centers and doing very well through that route. So again, if that, for any of you out there in the audience, if you're working in this particular area, it's a great area to think about for Japan. Next slide, please. Okay, let's move on to understanding a little bit more about Japan and the Japanese mindset. And as I said at the outset, for these this concluding part of the presentation, the next couple of slides that I'm going to go through, this is information that we would typically spend a half-day sort of training or briefing session. Typically, if there's a trade mission going out to Japan, we might come and do 2 or 3 hours to the audience or a half-day session, really diving in deeply to help people prepare best as they approach the Japanese market. Now, of course, for today's webinar, both with the time restriction we have, and also I realize this is just a sort of high-level introduction, so I will not drill down into anything like the sort of level of detail that I would normally do in a bigger session, but I will just touch on a few of the points, again, just to give you a little bit of a flavor as you're thinking about the Japanese market, or if you are preparing your first business visits over there. So first thing to be very aware of is it is very much a group mentality and group decision making. And identity comes from group affiliations. And there's very much a mindset with Japanese people. And the more time I've spent there and the more I've worked with Japanese people and the more Japanese people we employ, the more I appreciate the value in this way of thinking. Particularly that number 3 point where I say it's very much company first and individual second. And I can certainly vouch for that. It's a very interesting way of working and thinking. And certainly for me personally, that is a great value that I appreciate very much. And then I put that there is this consensus in decision making. And that's something you have to think about, of course, when you are approaching Japanese companies or partners to work with. There is an emergence of new Japanese business figures that is starting to put more emphasis on the individual. So I mentioned earlier that there is a bit of a trend for the younger generation coming through now, and there are some high-level Japanese entrepreneurs that are building a brand around themselves as an individual, and that is starting to change the way the younger generation think in Japan, which is probably a bit of a healthy thing too, but generally it is still very a traditional market out there. Next slide, please. So just a very small point to touch on here. This is one that I could spend a lot more sort of explaining in more detail, but the important thing here is this point we're making that the Japanese often make a distinction between their true feeling and what they know is the appropriate thing to say in public. And once you start to get your head around this and understand this, it's a very valuable thing to know when you're doing business with the Japanese. Where that becomes difficult for us foreigners when we're having interactions, whether it's face-to-face business meetings or Skype calls or telephone conference calls, it is very difficult to really understand the true feeling of what the Japanese are thinking in the way we are used to giving and receiving information when we have our typical Western business negotiations and discussions. We are used to a culture where we give and receive feedback both verbally and through hints and signals. But the culture in Japan is just completely different. It doesn't happen that way. It happens a different way. And if you're new to Japan, it's important that you recognize this point, because otherwise you can be a little bit disappointed if you feel you're not getting the initial feedback. But there are different ways of getting that feedback, which I'll touch on in the presentation. Next slide, please. So here's one example of where things can often be misunderstood. And I've been sitting at the meeting table just like this many times with a Japanese person on the other side, having a discussion or a negotiation or a presentation. And a comment will often come from the Japanese side, just like the one I've inserted there. And, I'm generalizing here to make the particular point, of course, but they may say, yes, we will think it over. And from our perspective, and I've seen this happen many times, we can interpret that as a very, very positive signal. And if you just click the next slide, please. One more, please. That's it, yeah. So from our side, we often think, wow, this sounds like I've won the business or I'm getting a positive reaction. But actually, all our Japanese counterpart is saying is they're just saying, yes, we will think it over. There's not really much more of a commitment than that in those words. It doesn't necessarily mean that we're going to do business. And in my early days of doing business out in Japan, I often got this wrong both ways. I interpreted things and I came out of the meeting thinking that went really well and it sounds like we're going to be doing business together. And then I spoke to my Japanese colleague who was with me in the meeting, and he or she would say, well, actually, Steve, no, I don't think we will be successful there. And likewise, the other way around, I've come out of meetings thinking that didn't go well at all and I didn't get a good vibe. But actually, my Japanese colleagues then say to me, we think we're in with a good chance here, Steve. So interpreting those non-verbal signals and understanding what the other side is thinking is a challenge in Japan. And again, I can talk about how you overcome that. Next slide, please. So just a few points here. From what I just said on the previous two slides, please don't interpret it as a sort of a two-faced or a bad way of doing business. You have to accept the fact it is just different. It's not, I'm not saying it's right, I'm not saying it's wrong, I'm not saying it's better, I'm not saying it's worse. It's just important to know that the Japanese way of doing business and interacting is different to the way we do it. And that's the important thing to be aware of to avoid frustration on your side. And it is simply used to maintain harmony, and you need to learn to read between the lines and pick those signals up. Saving face is a really important concept in Japan, and it involves the tendency to avoid embarrassing situations. And a good example is you will never see a Japanese person bring up new information during a meeting that their manager is not aware of. Showing modesty is a means of expressing respect in Japan. And an example of that, again, I've seen this many times, a Japanese person might come for a meeting to visit you in the UK, and they will bring a gift to that meeting, and they will always say, oh, this gift is not much, it's just a small gift that I brought for you. And the chances are it will be an amazing gift, probably very valuable, very well thought through. It's been hand carried over from Japan, but they will always be very modest and say, oh, this is just a small thing, it's not very much. And we often then feel really embarrassed because we haven't got them a gift at all. I've been in that situation a few times. But I think you're getting a flavor of some of the messages I'm trying to get across here. Okay, next slide, please. When someone belittles their own skills or their own possessions, you should never act as if you believe them. So building on my previous point, when that modesty comes across from a Japanese person, obviously understand why they are being modest and just don't believe it. It is just modesty. Instead, take their comments at face value and insist it's not true. Being humble is very important. Humility maintains group cohesion. And I always remember, this is not an expression in Japan, but it's one of our Western expressions, but I always remember it when I go out and have meetings in Japan. The nail that stands out often gets hammered down. And I think it's a very good thing to keep in your mindset. And that expression sums up to me in many ways the way the Japanese go about their decision making and thought process and business negotiations. Okay, next slide, please. This is more talking, and I'm going to go through it fairly quickly because I'm aware of the time a little bit. This is talking, building on what I'm basically saying. The Japanese mindset really believes in harmony. It believes that a group can achieve more than an individual. Japanese people listen first without interruptions. Then if they do disagree with what you're saying, it will be in a very vague and roundabout way, but it will be delivered in a way that should be open for someone that is experienced to interpret. There's no confrontation, priority is given to group harmony, and modest expressions are preferred. Next slide, please. It's very important to be aware of how the hierarchy works in Japan. It's still a little bit old-fashioned in that sense with management structures and hierarchy. So depending on your particular model of approaching your business in Japan and the kind of companies that you'll be doing business with, it's very important to be aware of how the hierarchy may work in companies, particularly if you're attempting to sell your product or your service to a larger organization or a larger company. Be aware of the hierarchy of presidents, managers, and subordinates and where you are fitting in and interacting with them. There is very, very much a strong, slightly old-fashioned view in our terms of the customer is absolutely king. Japan totally believes that, and the customer is in a very, very powerful position and tends to act in a very powerful position in a nice, gentle way. And relationships are lifelong and very, very highly valued in Japan. They take time to build, but once you've got them, they're very, very powerful assets. Next slide, please. Few little sort of key points here. This is the typical business card slide that you may have seen on other presentations about Japan. But the key points I'll make here is first impressions are very important in Japan. The most senior person is always introduced first. Business cards are received and given in both hands, and sort of appreciation is shown for those cards. The Japanese side is up, facing the receiver, and a business card, or a meishi as they refer to it in Japan, is considered an extension of a person or a person's soul. So for those of you going out to Japan for your business meetings, just remember some of these small details, and it will go a long way to show that you've done your homework and you are fitting in with the business culture there. Next slide, please. Same about the bowing. I'll go over this very quickly because this is sort of detail, and it's not something to get overly concerned about, but it just gives an example of the importance of the cultural issue. There are 3 different types of bow. Please don't worry if you don't get it right. The Japanese are very aware that we do not really have bowing in our culture. And please keep in mind that the Japanese may try to shake hands with you instead of bowing, because they realize that we tend to shake hands rather than bowing. But if they do try and shake hands, the Japanese side are normally very awkward in the way they do it, and it can often feel a bit uncomfortable anyway. But not a major issue, and not something I would say to get too concerned about. So, next slide, please. So just coming to the summary and the conclusion as we wrap this presentation up, and I hope it's been useful for you. Some of the key points I would just say are: be aware that talks and discussions and negotiations in Japan often proceed more slowly than we are used to in the Western world. But this, in the Japanese eyes, this is essential for relationship building. It's not what we would regard as a hire and fire business culture. So what I really mean by that is, if you are in a position where you need to get quick results and you need to generate revenue, then there are clearly other markets that I would recommend you go to first, where you will find it much easier to do business and quicker to do business and quicker to get revenue in the door. But of course, the counterbalance to that is quite often those markets and those cultures, if it's easy to get the business, it's also equally as easy to lose the business. And you might be the flavor of the month one moment, and then the next minute something else comes along and people change their mind. That's what I mean by the hire and fire culture. Certainly from my experience of doing business in Japan, it takes longer and you have to work hard to get it. But once you've got the business and the relationship, providing you don't let anyone down, you keep delivering, the chances are you will have a very, very long and fruitful relationship. And quite a few of the businesses that I'm involved in out there, we are still selling products to customers that I first sold to 10 plus years ago, and the business just ticks along very, very nicely. It was hard work to win that business initially, but I've had my payback over many, many times over the years. In terms of negotiation tips, I cannot emphasize how important it is to prepare thoroughly. Don't be too outspoken, don't be too aggressive, and don't worry if there's silence in the meetings or the discussions. It's very, very important to demonstrate signals of long-term business relationships. That, again, you can sense the theme that's coming out here. And to give you an example, I've been in meetings where towards the conclusion of a presentation, the Japanese side will say, can you just explain a little bit more about your long-term vision or your long-term strategy? And my side, and me and my colleagues might talk about our strategy for the next 5 years, thinking that's long-term. And then the Japanese side will reply and say, well, okay, that's the next 5 years, but where's your strategy for the next 10 years or 15 years? So in terms of thinking long-term, it means a very different thing in Japan, but it also is a reflection on how stable those business relationships are and how long-term they think about getting into business relationships. And then the final point is local representation in Japan is really essential if you're going to be serious about the market and developing good business out there. And of course, there's lots of ways you can do it: an agent, distributor, consultants, or even hiring your own local staff if if that's something that fits your business model and your budget. So I would certainly say getting that local help is a very strong way to overcome some of those challenges that I mentioned about doing business in Japan. Okay, I'm very, very aware of the time. I'll probably just run over my slot very slightly, so my apologies for that, but I hope I've put across some good points for you there, and I hope we've left enough time for some Q&A to tackle now. So thank you.
Many thanks, Steve. That was fantastic. Really great overview. It's a really interesting market, and one with plenty of opportunities and interest, I'm sure. Yeah, as Steve mentioned, we're now going to go to questions. Please do feel free to ask any questions you like using the control panel on the right-hand side of the screen. And the first one I'm going to ask is one you alluded to in the presentation and one we've had both live and in advance, and it's around setting up an office in Japan. And I'm going to frame this as 3 parts. Firstly, how long can it take to set up an office? How easy is it? And when should you do it? Over to you, Steve.
Okay, great. Thank you. Good questions. Okay, so in terms of answering all 3 of those questions, really, one thing I will say is there are various ways to set up an office or a presence in Japan. And I mentioned earlier that the Japanese government have been very active over the last 4 or 5 years. The Abe administration in particular have been very aggressive on bringing barriers down and doing everything they can to make it easy. So there are many ways you can do it, and it really depends on your business model and your strategy, and of course the level of investment and the size of the opportunity out there for you. So if you're at one end of the scale and you want to do things cost effectively and you want to minimize your risk, but you want to sort of maximize the impact, then there are options out there for I hate to use the word virtual office because it's not a virtual office. It's really the wrong word to use, but I can't think of a better one right now. But there are companies out there that can set you up an operation in Japan and locally manage that operation for you. And that actually can be done, frankly, within a week. So coming back to the point about how long does it take to do it, it can all be done very, very quickly through those options. And in fact, Business Link Japan is one company that offers that. The Business Link Japan organization have got an innovation hub in Tokyo, and that is the home base for a number of British companies as their first step into the Japanese market. And it's a low cost, low risk way of doing it, but you get a presence in Japan. And they'll do all the things like, put your a dedicated phone number in. The phone number will be answered by a Japanese person in your name. You get a Japanese office address, the post gets sent there and things like that. So to the Japanese customers, it looks exactly like you've got your own Japanese entity, but you're sort of doing it through an outsourced partner. And then when you start to move on from that, if you want to have your own office out there and your own staff out there, and then think about incorporating your own company out there, all of that can really be done within, as a sort of minimum, it can be done within a 2 to 3 month time scale to be done properly. Can be done a little bit quicker than that, but you really are under pressure. But it's not vast time scales to really incorporate a company out there, get some office space, and get your first staff on board. So that's sort of how long to do it and how easy or difficult it is. On the difficulty question, even incorporating your own company now is much less difficult than it used to be 10 years ago, because the government is bringing those barriers down. So all relatively easy. One big question just to think about for anyone that is considering to incorporate out there, there is an issue around having a representative director that I'll just flag up that is a bit of a challenge, but I won't go into the detail on that. If anyone wants more information, just contact me. In terms of when to do it, it really does depend on your strategy for the Japanese market and how important having a presence out there is. On my concluding slide, I said that having a local presence or local help is really important. So my view very much is if you are serious about the market, it is a very important thing to do. And it's the key to becoming successful, is to have someone out there batting on your side that understands the local culture and the language, etc. But when to do it, really has to be your decision. I guess what I would say is just don't do it until you've done your research, you've done your homework, you've got your head around the size of the market and the opportunity. Your product or service does have some opportunity out there. You've maybe got your first few orders and got the revenue coming, and started to feel your way around the market. and you get to that point where you think, yes, I'm feeling really good about this opportunity, and I really want to go to that next level now of having some local presence or local representation, that would be exactly the right time to do it. And that will be a different time for different companies, of course. Does that answer the question, Will?
Yeah, I believe so, and I think it's answered a couple of others which come up as well. So
Okay.
thank you for that, Steve.
All right, great.
We've had a decent flood of questions that's come through. So I'm afraid we won't get to all of these, but I'll try and do as many as we can. One question we've had in from Alison, and she's asked kind of what is the Japanese perception of British people and British business culture? And addendum to that is, do they like Western style food? That might be one for the food and drink people out there. So yeah, perception of us Brits.
Yes, I think it's really good. I'm pleased to say it is very, very good. I think we have a very high standing out in Japan, and yeah, we're regarded very well, both as people. I think we fit the Japanese culture very well. Going back to some of my earlier points about the island culture and the island mentality, we're both from a similar size country, so that's very good. And we are generally fairly modest, gentle people, not overly aggressive in our business transactions. So I think we fit those cultural characteristics very well. In terms of sort of on the business side, with regard to products and services, the UK and British brands and being British are very, very strong in Japan. It would be wrong of me to say just sort of carte blanche and anything with a Union Jack flag or symbol on it suddenly sells well. That's not the case at all. It needs to be, you know, generally speaking, it is items of high quality that are good quality design, very well manufactured, good quality packaging, good quality service level around it. They are the kind of products and brands and services that tend to resonate very, very well with the Japanese consumers. And of course, the great news is those kind of products tend to also command high pricing. And linking it to the points I made in the presentation about the disposable income in Japan, one thing I love about Japanese consumers is they automatically link price with quality. So it's part of the process of buying something as a consumer. If it's a very well-designed, well-made product, they would expect to pay very good money for it. And that's part of the experience. It's not a culture where they try and get the best quality product at the cheapest possible price. So lots of good things that we should be proud about being British that do stand out very well in Japan. In terms of the specific point about food stuff, certainly British food and drink has got a place in the Japanese market. I used the Brewdog example earlier of one that's been very successful, and there's plenty of others we could talk about. It tends to be, again, following the theme, it tends to be more niche, high quality products that tend to be very successful and find their place in the Japanese market. And of course, when I use the word niche, even if you're in a small niche in the Japanese market, because it's so big, that niche can be quite significant, of course. But that, you know, fitting that theme of something that's high quality, well packaged, well produced, well made, good service around it, fitting a little niche, they're the ones that tend to do very, very well out in Japan in the food and drink sector. So I hope that's answered the question.
Good stuff. And yeah, I mean, I think from my own experience at Brewdog and Japan, so I can definitely vouch on that point. Another question, which I think is quite a key one from Alistair, is around for things like business cards and brochures. How important is translation, and kind of what tips would you give in terms of getting things translated into Japanese?
Okay, great. So my view would be absolutely put some time and effort into getting that stuff translated and localized. You know, particularly if you are serious about the market, because on the other side, on the Japanese side, that sort of stuff is really appreciated. And coming back to some of the themes that I brought out in the presentation about showing your commitment, showing your long-term vision, showing, you know, the way you're focused on the market, they are all the very subtle things that give a very important signal to the Japanese consumers, or if you're in the B2B world, you know, the Japanese businesses that you're working with. And it's not, in this day and age, it's not hugely expensive to do that kind of stuff, but it does go an awful long way. The way I often think about it is, if you're approaching Japanese customers out there and expecting them to buy your product and service, if you're giving all of the information in English and expecting them to digest it and read it in English, particularly if that information is valuable, if it's stuff that they need to know about your product in order to know whether to buy it, it's almost a bit rude and a bit arrogant to just do all of that in English, isn't it? So for me, with all the businesses I'm involved in, we put time and money and effort into localizing stuff as much as possible before we approach the customers out there as a strong signal. And we can, through the Export to Japan platform, we've got a whole range of partner companies, service suppliers out there that can help with localization and printing and translation and all that sort of stuff. So if anyone ever needs any help with any of that stuff, then have a look at Export to Japan, because there are specialist partners out there that can help you with that.
Absolutely. And yeah, I mean, get so many questions in. So the next one I'm going to ask, hopefully we'll cover a couple of them. And it's just around, I mean, a few people asked about whether you need a license or if you need regulation, or kind of what regulations might apply if you're selling X or Y into Japan. Where can you find out that sort of information about kind of technical requirements and kind of legal requirements for selling things into Japan?
Yeah, sure. Well, I know for sure, well, on the Open to Export platform, there's a lot of good information, not just about Japan, but globally as well. So that I would certainly tell people to have a look there and see what information you've got on Open to Export. That's a good start point. But of course, that platform is global, so you're covering lots of markets, and that might limit the amount of detail you have on specific markets. So the next port of call after that is most definitely the Export to Japan digital platform website. So just for everyone's benefit, it's export to japan.co.jp. And that platform is designed in conjunction with the UK government, and it is a wealth of information on things like regulations, trading, exporting, duties, customs, as well as lots of good specific sector information. There's a way you can look at the information by your particular sector. If you're in food and drink, there's a whole range of information about other British companies in the food and drink sector that are doing well in Japan, and exhibitions and shows in that sector, and there's white papers and case studies and things. So lots and lots of resource and information. I think we've got over 100 on-demand videos now on different aspects of doing business in Japan that you can have a look at. So for all of that stuff, your first port of call is definitely Export to Japan and having a look at the content there. What you can then do, if you can't find the particular content you've got, or if you do want further help, there's lots of points on that website where you can hit the send your inquiry button. And if you just send your inquiry in, one of the Export to Japan team will have a look at that and either attempt to answer it for you, or if we can't answer it, we'll try and direct you in the right direction for where you can get the answer or where you can find the information. So that would certainly be my suggestion for finding out more information, Will.
Thank you. And I think I'm going to try and do one more question because we're starting to run a little bit low on time. And it's just around kind of meeting people out in Japan, whether it's kind of agents, distributors, or you've had a couple of questions about trade missions, what's going on in terms of UK government trade missions out there.
Right.
So what sort of advice would you give for companies looking to just kind of feel their way into the market, meet people, and do the whole networking part of it?
Yeah, okay. Certainly, trade missions absolutely are a great way to do it, and one of the most effective ways to do it. That, from a cost-effective point of view, if there is a trade mission going out that is in your particular sector, or from your geographic region or something, I would certainly explore that. Again, I'll just mention, I don't want to keep beating the same drum, but the upcoming trade missions are always published well in advance on Export to Japan as well. So that's another good place to keep an eye open for upcoming events and trade missions and things. That's a great way to do it. And I certainly have a view that if you can get over there, whether it's part of a trade mission or if there's no suitable trade mission coming up, try and get a visit over there yourself and meet with potential agents or distributors face to face. From my experience, and of course, I know the audience that we've got here today are all people probably experienced in doing business all over the world. You cannot beat those face to face discussions and negotiations. I've seen a whole wealth of examples where a company will sign up with a Japanese company that they met at a trade show here in the UK or something. You know, this company came along as a delegate onto the stand that a UK company had, and gave a big promise that they would be the answer to everything in Japan. And often there's a good honeymoon period initially, but then it might start to run out of steam a little bit. And they may have found that if they'd have got over to Japan and met with several potential distributors, there might have been an even better one that they could have signed up with. So trying to get over there, if your budget and your time allows, and if there is a trade mission, is by far and away the best way to do it. For those that don't know, there are support services through the UK government. The division that's now branded as DIT are very good at helping with services to not only run the trade missions, but also introduce potential distributors and do little bits of market research and things to draw up lists of potential distributors and things. So well worth putting enquiries in and seeing if DIT can help you with that stuff as well through the various embassies and posts around the world. Again, those kind of inquiries, if you wanted help with that, you can post those on Export to Japan, and they will get passed through to the relevant person at the British Embassy out in Tokyo.
Great, many thanks. And yeah, if anyone's got any inquiries generally about finding trade shows to any market, we're always happy to try and put you in the right direction as well. But anyway, yeah, thank you. I think we're going to have to wrap up now, but thank you once again. That was a really great webinar, really concise and thorough overview of what is a huge but really interesting market. So thank you very much to Steve and to Export to Japan. Hope everyone has found that useful.
Great, thank you. It's our pleasure. Thank you for the opportunity.
Great. So just moving on, before we leave, I'll just do a couple of quick signpostings. Our graduation ceremony in London is now only a week away, so if you want to go, please do sign up to that quickly. It's a great opportunity to meet some of the future stars of international trade and to network with senior figures and decision makers across the industry today, including the Secretary of State for International Trade, Dr. Liam Fox. Go to export.org.uk/events to find sign-up details for all that. And perhaps next year, it could be yourself or someone from your business graduating with a qualification in international trade. Our qualifications are designed to give individuals and businesses the skills they need to export successfully and compliantly, something that will become even more important in the coming years, I'm sure. So you can find out details about our qualifications and how they can help your business to go global on export.org.uk/qualifications. We are really delighted to today announce our first ever international competition, the Open to Export International Business Awards, which we are running with the support of the World Trade Organization and the International Chamber of Commerce as part of their Small Business Champions Initiative this summer. They are a great opportunity for companies from anywhere in the world to win $5,000 towards their export action plans, and the final will be taking place in Geneva in October as part of the WTO's public forum. This is a great chance. This will be a great chance to meet key business leaders, government officials, journalists, international officials, and many more from the glitterati of world trade. So please do have a look at this wonderful opportunity. More information can be found at opentoexport.com/international-business-awards. And finally, our next webinar sees us continuing to look beyond the EU as we look at China for the first time in a couple of years in June. And we're also looking at Australia for the first time in July. You can find sign-up details to all of our future webinars at opentoexport.com/webinars. As always, please do take our exit survey to let us know what you thought of today's webinar and to give us any suggestions for improvements or for future topics. But for now, many thanks and goodbye.